So the focus here is on a new book, Making Failure Feasible. And I must say at the beginning that one of the leaders in developing this book was Ken Scott, who's unable to be here today, but in some sense rallied many of us together to get this done. Another person I want to mention briefly who was part of this operation from the beginning, and that's George Shultz. George Shultz is very active. In fact, in the preface to this, we quote him about what we're after, because the title has attracted some interesting comment. Why do you want to make failure feasible? And this is what George says. The right question is, how do we make failure tolerable? If clear and credible measures can be put into place that convince everybody that failure will be allowed, then the expectations of bailouts will recede and perhaps even disappear. So that's the concept, that's the goal. And a lot has happened during the years. We've been working on this. This is the third in a series. And so this is a great time. And there's legislation that's moving, both the House and the Senate. In many respects, it looks like, to me, like some low-hanging fruit. We should be able to get something done. But the back and forth is really important. Really great that you could be here. I'm really very pleased Tom Honig from the FDIC could be here, and others. So we're going to have two panels. The first panel is really from authors of the book. Tom Jackson, who has really done the most of the work on developing this Chapter 14 bankruptcy proposal, is here by phone. Tom, are you there?
Yes, I am,
okay,
John.
Good. He's got lots of snow in Rochester. Somehow the snow circled around and came from the north, surprised everybody. So he's already snowed in. And in addition, Emily Kapoor, who's one of the chapter authors in the book, really a fascinating case study of what would have happened at Lehman had we had Chapter 14. I think it's an important question to address. And Bill Croner, who's analyzed how Chapter 14 would affect the living wills process. And so they're going to both talk about that. And I'll be monitoring. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave a little early to get a plane. But we're going to begin with Tom. Tom's going to give some remarks by the phone, and then we'll go to Em and to Bill. Tom, you ready?
Yes, I am, John.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Again, sorry I'm not there in person. I'd like to give some opening comments on the role bankruptcy law, I think, can and should play in the best possible resolution of a troubled financial institution. And to pick up on John's comment, by the best possible resolution of a troubled financial institution, I think there are four important conditions to be met. First, one that minimizes losses and places them on appropriate pre-identified parties. Second, one that minimizes systemic consequences. Third, one that does not result in a government bailout. And fourth, one that's predictable in the sense of conforming to the rule of law in its myriad dimensions. Now, unless Congress was being exceptionally cynical, Dodd-Frank envisions that bankruptcy is supposed to work. The resolution plans, so-called living wills under Title I, are specifically to be focused on and tested against a bankruptcy resolution process. Moreover, an administrative resolution proceeding under Title II cannot be commenced without a finding that the use of bankruptcy law would have a serious adverse effect on U.S. financial stability. But I think there's a disconnect between those premises and today's bankruptcy code. There has been an emerging consensus that I think we can talk about and play off of, that the best resolution system, one that meets at least the first three standards I noted above, involves A, loss-bearing capacity known in advance, that B, can be jettisoned in a rapid recapitalization of a financial institution. In the United States, this is represented by the FDIC's single point of entry proposal. Now, the requirement of loss-bearing capacity, a long-term debt, subordinated debt, bail-in debt, whatever, is outside of bankruptcy law, but it's critical for any single point of entry type resolution regime, and regulatory bodies are far along in developing this necessary element, as others will be discussing. But even with that, compared to the FDIC's administrative resolution proposal, current bankruptcy law comes up short. While Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code is increasingly used to effectuate a going concern sale of a business, sometimes rapidly through a prepackaged plan, it's going to struggle to do this in the case of a financial institution. The essence of the needed recapitalization is leaving behind equity and loss-bearing debt and the transfer of everything else, assets, liabilities, rights, subsidiaries, to a new company that, because of the stripping off of the loss-bearing debt, is presumably both solvent and in a position to deal with the needs of its subsidiaries. And it must be done with great speed so as to restore market confidence without a contagion-producing run. I think both of those conditions are problematic under Bankruptcy Code without modification. Because of the exemption of qualified financial contracts from most of bankruptcy's provisions, including the automatic stay, and because of the lack of clear statutory language permitting the assignment of liabilities or the override of cross defaults or change of control provisions, I don't think the current Bankruptcy Code can provide the necessary assurance that it can consummate such a recapitalization. Even with the announcement of the protocol by the International Swaps and Derivative Associations that ends the automatic termination of qualified financial contracts in a resolution proceeding, the problem remains. First, it's limited to a subset of financial institutions, and it doesn't deal with cross-default or change of control provisions in licenses or other kinds of contracts. Nor is it certain to me that a judge would feel comfortable, even with a resolution plan, authorizing the transfer and hence recapitalization under the current Bankruptcy Code in a period such as 48 hours. That will lead, in my view, either to ineffective or, in fact, impossible resolution plans and or the reality that the orderly liquidation authority under Title II will, contrary to what I think Dodd-Frank intended, become the default resolution mechanism. I think focused amendments to bankruptcy law, Chapter 14, is the solution. Doing so can harmonize resolution plans with what is, in fact, currently perceived to be the best way to deal with the troubled financial institutions. And those fixes to bankruptcy law can ensure that Title II becomes, in fact, a process of last resort. What is required, in addition to specific loss-absorbing capacity known in advance that's being addressed separately, it requires explicit statutory authorization for a rapid 48-hour transfer of a holding company's assets, liabilities, rights, and subsidiaries, minus the loss-absorbing debt and equity, to a bridge institution, new institution, and stays and overrides of certain provisions to enable that to happen. Our Chapter 14 proposal in the book, I think, neatly provides the necessary amendments to permit a rapid recapitalization that will first leave losses on previously identified parties, that is, equity and capital structure debt of the holding company, and second, rapidly recapitalize the parent institution in a way that will make it clear that it is solvent, its business has been kept together, and it's able to deal with its subsidiaries so as to restore market confidence and reduce contagion. It, I believe, meets all four of the conditions I noted at the start of these comments. While there will be issues such as cross-border resolution that I'm certain the panels will get into a discussion of later, I'd like to address, in closing, a couple objections I've heard to Chapter 14. One is that financial institutions don't deserve a special bankruptcy process. And to be certain, some of the Chapter 14 provisions, such as the rollback of the exemptions from the automatic stay for qualified financial contracts, should, in my view, take place across the board. But it's undeniable the place where they're going to have the greatest impact is with financial institutions. And at this point, a focused bill is more likely than a broad-reaching bill. Beyond that, most of the features of Chapter 14 are focused on something that is indeed unique about financial institutions, and that is the need for almost overnight clarity. It doesn't so much change an existing bankruptcy process, that is a going concern sale of a business, as much as it provides a way to do that with certainty over a weekend. The other features that make this work, such as loss-absorbing capital structure debt, are not features of Chapter 14, but features of the non-bankruptcy regulatory regime. Our Chapter 14 proposal continues with full vigor the rule of law fulfilling absolute priority rule embedded in the current bankruptcy law. that's a set of early comments to get the ball going. Again, I'm sorry I could not be with the panel in person.
Thank you very much, Tom. We assume you're going to stick around and listen and jump in when you can.
I will do so, John.
Great, thank you.
Thanks,
Em?
Tom.
Yeah.
I'm Emily Kapoor, an attorney and economist at Stanford University and the Hoover Institution. And as John mentioned, I wrote one of the chapters of the book, which is entitled The Next Lehman Bankruptcy. In my chapter, I used discovery and court documents available from Lehman's Chapter 11 case to assess whether our proposed Chapter 14, which Tom just mentioned, could have allowed Lehman to fail without systemic consequences. And I argue in the book that because perceived insolvency drove the run on Lehman Brothers, and because that run was relatively foreseeable, Lehman's would have been the type of case that Chapter 14 and SPOE are best structured to address. My remarks this morning will first walk through a hypothetical, counterfactual Chapter 14 bankruptcy case for Lehman Brothers, and will then address a few important lessons from Lehman's experience. To understand how Chapter 14 might work in practice, recall the market environment of 2008 and imagine Lehman Brothers has balance sheets, contractual relationships, and operational systems similar to those that it had at the time. But in this counterfactual, Dodd-Frank, Chapter 14, the new TLAC rules are all in force in the US, and both the ISDA Universal Resolution State Protocol and the Bank Resolution and Recovery Directive are in place internationally. As I detail in my chapter, as of Friday, September 5th, 2008, which was 10 days before Lehman filed for bankruptcy, markets still perceived Lehman to be solvent, but by only about $2 billion. Internally, Lehman was preparing to announce third quarter losses that would be $2 billion more than markets expected. Thus, there was every reason for this announcement to eliminate markets' perceptions of solvency. And sure enough, once Lehman announced its third quarter losses and conceded that its efforts to raise capital had failed, creditors and counterparties ran. Lehman lost $30 billion of liquidity over a week as repo lenders pulled funding, prime brokerage clients withdrew accounts, and derivatives counterparties and clearing banks demanded additional collateral. In the process, it also lost about $9 billion of capital. It's important that a firm file for Chapter 14 before a run of this magnitude begins in order to ensure that the new firm will have sufficient operating liquidity and capacity to absorb losses. In 2008, Lehman's management was unwilling to file for bankruptcy until the very last hour. Under Chapter 14, however, the Fed may also file a case. Suppose that the Fed, perhaps operating with knowledge that Lehman is about to announce these outsized losses, determines it is time for Lehman to undergo Chapter 14 on Friday, September 5th, before creditors begin to run. If there is sufficient bail in debt, as there almost surely is, then there's every reason to expect Chapter 14 to prevent any systemic consequences. And Title II is therefore foreclosed by its own terms because, as Tom mentioned, it cannot be used if bankruptcy will work. Recall that Lehman Brothers had a holding company at the top that owned thousands of subsidiaries, including Lehman's New York and London broker-dealers. To begin the Chapter 14 process, the Fed files a case on behalf of Lehman Holdings. That filing triggers an expanded automatic stay and other bankruptcy rules, as Tom briefly outlined. Importantly, this case is only for holdings. All of Lehman's subsidiaries, including its broker-dealers, remain outside of bankruptcy, and the expanded stay safeguards their operations. Upon filing, the Fed makes a motion to sell all of Holdings' assets and liabilities except its TLAC-eligible debt. The purchaser is a non-bankrupt company called New Holdings, whose equity the bankruptcy estate will own. The Fed sends notice to Lehman's largest creditors and its subsidiaries' regulators that parties may raise objections at a hearing that's scheduled for Saturday evening. Though the time frame is short, Lehman has already worked with these parties to develop a Chapter 14 living will, so no one is caught by surprise. The court must conclude the hearing by Sunday, but need make only cursory findings, namely that the Fed has certified that the new company provides adequate assurance of future performance on its contracts, and that the Holdings estate will be able to choose new Lehman's directors within a month. The structure of this hearing strikes a balance, on the one hand offering parties an opportunity to be heard, especially on management issues, while on the other ensuring that the process moves along quickly enough to prevent systemic effects. On Sunday, the court approves the transfer, assuming all goes well. New Holdings now exits entirely outside the bankruptcy system. It is managed by private sector individuals that the Fed has chosen for their ability to maximize value for holding single owner, the bankruptcy estate. New Holdings owns all assets previously owned by Holdings, including all of Lehman's subsidiaries, and has also assumed most of Holdings' liabilities, except for the TLAC-eligible debt. The subsidiaries themselves have not gone through bankruptcy at all, and various Bankruptcy Code provisions have prevented adverse effects from the parent company's filing, at least under U.S. law. Thanks to the new ISDA protocol, derivative repo and other secured transaction contracts are mostly still in force to the extent that they are covered by that, notwithstanding the Chapter 14 filing. Internationally, regulators already worked with Lehman and the Fed before the case was filed and agreed not to ring-fence assets in response to the filing. If that had not occurred, the Fed would have had trouble making the requisite certifications to the court. Though there's no treaty in place to ensure cooperation, there's every reason to expect this process to work at least as well as regulatory cooperation between the FDIC and counterparty regulators, and the living will process could help it to work better. I'll return in a moment to the question of whether the TLAC rules would have required Lehman to hold sufficient loss absorption capacity, but assume for the purposes of this counterfactual story that they do. If so, the bankruptcy proceeding makes clear to markets that even after recognizing its real estate losses, the company headed by New Holdings, call it New Lehman, is very well capitalized. When markets open in Asia on Monday morning, Lehman's broker-dealers are able to continue to provide key financial services, and there's no reason for creditors to run. Furthermore, because the proceeding was undertaken before a major run began, New Lehman can withstand a moderate drain on liquidity as markets adjust. There's no reason for investors to run on money market funds, and no reason for hedge funds to curtail lending to corporations. Investment banks are less crunched for liquidity, and they're less likely to turn to the Fed for financing. Eventually, New Lehman will make a public offering of stock in order to value the bankruptcy estate's ownership interest. The estate then follows the standard bankruptcy priority requirements to distribute its assets and close up shop. There are only two classes of claimants, the subordinated debt holders and the shareholders. Most likely, the valuation is such that the shareholders are wiped out and debt holders are paid only in part. All of the other creditors are creditors of New Lehman and not of the bankruptcy estate, and so they're paid in full at maturity. Thus, relative to Lehman's Chapter 11 case, shareholders make out the same, and everyone else does better, reducing the overall losses by hundreds of billions of dollars relative to Lehman's Chapter 11 case. Risks of systemic effects are minimized, both because the quick proceeding allows the firm to continue operating and because all parties expect lower losses. Nonetheless, unlike in a bailout, a substantial portion of creditors do sustain losses, and the procedure demonstrates that even a Lehman Brothers type firm can safely fail. These fairly optimistic conclusions, however, do hinge upon three assumptions holding true, and these assumptions in turn raise a number of lessons from Lehman's case. The first assumption is that no foreign resolution proceedings generate major costs for New Lehman. In Lehman's Chapter 11 case, dozens of international proceedings made it impossible for the firm to continue as a going concern. The living will process and the Fed's ability to drive a Chapter 14 case, unlike the current Bankruptcy Code, will both be important in preventing any such costs in the future, and likely sufficient as a whole, though I'm sure we'll hear more about this on the second panel. The second assumption is that Lehman held enough equity and subordinated debt to absorb all losses and still convince the markets that it was highly solvent after Chapter 14. As I wrote the chapter in the book before the Fed released its proposed TLAC regulations, I used Lehman's actual long-term debt and equity figures to estimate its loss cushion. And on that basis, I found a loss cushion of $116 billion, which would have been sufficient for New Lehman to be highly solvent even after writing down almost any reasonable measure of losses. There are insufficient data to precisely calculate Lehman's required TLAC debt, but estimates can provide a sense of magnitude. With hearty thanks to Wilson Irvin for his assistance in arriving at this figure, it appears that the TLAC rules would have caused Lehman to have a loss absorption capacity that would be convertible under the Chapter 14 rules of around $100 billion total, including both debt and equity. Importantly, expected losses from a Chapter 14 case would include only embedded losses and some minimal friction costs from the proceeding. Estimates of embedded losses for Lehman have ranged from around 30 to 40 billion. If friction costs, such as those associated with getting new financing for the new institution, were around 5 to 10 billion, that would leave New Lehman with between 50 billion at the low end and 65 billion at the high end of perceived equity in the marketplace, around double the book equity that Lehman had before the Chapter 14 proceeding. Thus, I think the lesson from Lehman's case is that in similar circumstances, firms will be able to absorb quite substantial embedded losses, even well in excess of capital, and still be well capitalized following Chapter 14. Finally, to succeed with a Chapter 14 case, New Lehman would have needed to access enough liquidity in the marketplace following the proceeding. This challenge is closely related to the solvency figures I just mentioned, as a substantial loss absorption cushion suggests a much easier time accessing financing in the market. New Lehman would have had several sound liquidity options. In my chapter, I walked through a stress test based upon Lehman's own liquidity figures to show that New Lehman could withstand a moderate run. Though, unfortunately, he isn't here with us today, David Skeel also does a wonderful job in his chapter of analyzing the many and varied avenues available to a post-Chapter 14 firm for accessing liquidity, including both private options and the possibility of adding to Chapter 14 an amendment to allow for Fed emergency secured lending. But the key lesson from Lehman's case is that if the loss cushion is large enough, it will both make a firm's ex-post solvency obvious and will help to absorb possible costs associated with financing the firm in a skeptical marketplace. To conclude, under certain reasonable assumptions, a Chapter 14 case would have returned Lehman to solvency and thereby forestalled the run that occurred in 2008. Certain creditors would have sustained real losses, but creditors as a whole would have lost hundreds of billions of dollars less than in Lehman's Chapter 11 case. These expectations of lower losses in turn would have reduced further the risk of runs and systemic costs. To the extent that Lehman's filing contributed to the global financial crisis, I think our proposed Chapter 14 could have helped to avoid some of its worst consequences. But as I expect today's second panel to address in depth, Chapter 14 can only work with continued progress toward effective international cooperation, sufficient loss absorption capacity, and concerted planning for possible liquidity crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Bill?
I will be mindful of the time and keep my remarks brief. Although I can't say in this beautiful Hoover News space that I can see out the windows, the audience can't. There are as yet no snowflakes.
You can see the U.S. Treasury, too.
Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Council and Hoover for putting this together. It's been my wonderful experience as well as pleasure to work. This is the third Hoover book I've worked on as a practitioner. My own contribution in this book is really to put the Chapter 14 proposal that Hoover's come up with in the context of kind of the Dodd-Frank and resolution practices. It's revised Chapter 14 2.0, as we call it, and the living will requirements under the Dodd-Frank Act. As most of you know, Title I of Dodd-Frank requires a number of institutions to come up with living wills showing how they could be resolved under the bankruptcy laws, not under Title II, in a credible manner. There have been challenges putting those together. It's an ongoing process. There are challenges to credibility. A lot of that comes from some of the inherent character of the bankruptcy laws that are, as Tom Jackson has pointed out, not well designed for financial intermediaries. We're learning in the past few days that it's also not well designed for commonwealths of the United States of America. That's a different Hoover book. That's not this one. This one focuses on financial intermediaries. What the proposal does is deal with the timing difficulty, and if Chapter 14, as proposed, the revisions were put into effect, it would be easier for institutions to write living wills that could be found credible, because some of the stumbling blocks that we saw in Lehman, in its experience, would no longer exist, and that would make it less necessary, perhaps, to default to orderly liquidation under Title II, which is the default if a bankruptcy reorganization is not feasible for one of these institutions. Now, I can tell you from 11 years at the FDIC that when an institution is in trouble, there is a lot of adrenaline among the resolutions people. And there is a temptation to use the powers you have, and the FDIC has done an excellent job of putting sort of the essence of the way it resolves insured financial institutions into Title II. So it has those powers. If it defaults to those powers rather than bankruptcy, we actually lose a lot in terms of transparency, in terms of predictability. You want that to be very, very infrequently used. And the proposed changes to the bankruptcy law would help get to that result. I would ask you, if you look at, the FDIC has actually done some work on what an orderly liquidation of Lehman Brothers might have looked like, and published it soon after Dodd-Frank came into effect in its research publication. And the Hoover book does a counterfactual on Lehman as to what the Lehman situation might have looked like under revised Chapter 14. And I would ask you, in thinking about this legislative proposal in the context of Dodd-Frank powers, if you look at the FDIC study, it shows that Lehman creditors would have recovered something on the order of 97 cents on the dollar if orderly liquidation were used. On the other hand, if you look at the study in our book, it's a good deal less. And in thinking about what sort of resolution makes sense for the society with transparency and speed, I would just leave you with the question here, which one of those do you think is the bailout? And with that, I'm
Thank you,
done.
Bill. Okay. So let's open it up to questions. And Aaron, you want to go ahead? George?
Yeah, I have a question about, by the way, this all sounds like great stuff. I can't wait to read the book and thank you all for the
Thank you.
my question is about the role of the Fed and the discretion that particularly with regard to relying on it occasionally to file under the proposed, relying on it to file under the, to take the initiative of filing under the proposed code. And I guess my general question is, do you think that this can work even in the absence of other measures that reduce the Fed's discretionary power to engage in bailouts? In other words, you're asking the Fed in some situations to decide whether to file for bankruptcy or to bail out a firm, and that seems to raise the issue of whether the incentive structure is such that it would do the right thing under existing rules.
Tom, if you can hear us, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Well, yeah. Although maybe Bill should, because it seems to me that the question is the ability of the FDIC to bail a firm out outside of either resolution or bankruptcy, if I understand the question, as an alternative to either using bankruptcy or the resolution process. And Bill may want to talk about that. It seems to me the Dodd-Frank, at least in Title II and maybe otherwise, pretty severely limits the ability of these institutions to be bailed out outside of any kind of resolution process.
Let me try to take a crack at that. It raises your question raises a number of issues, actually. I'm an FDIC guy. You should understand, the FDIC has not had ability to bail anybody out since about 1992. The FDIC the Fed would make loans under 13.3, and then they would pull those loans, get repaid, and stick the FDIC with the losses. That's kind of the FDIC view of the situation. The Fed's authority under 13.3 was obviously cut back in Dodd-Frank, which means the tools you're looking at for the Fed and the FDIC to use jointly are more limited than they were. Perhaps more limited than they should be. I think there's a BPC paper on precisely this point that was written by some very distinguished fellows. But be that as it may, because of that limitation, you're going to be in a stress situation, limited, hopefully in our view, to the Chapter 14 amendments or to orderly liquidation. And we think with the Chapter 14 amendments, there would be a broader mania than there would be, and less of a temptation to actually bail out for those that may consider OLA, the Orderly Liquidation Authority, to be bailed out, where you have a set of tools that really can work under the bankruptcy laws. We know what we have under the bankruptcy laws right now has some limitations and inhibitions and may be impractical in a lot of situations.
So, Bill, as you point out, BPC has a paper written by John Dugan, Peter Fisher, and Chuck Muckenfuss, which actually calls to repeal Dodd-Frank's prohibitions on the Fed's use of emergency lending. We think they kind of get moral hazard backwards. But with that, let me turn to another question in the audience, in the back.
Hi, I'm Kurt Schuler from the Treasury Department. Is there anybody who already has something like the Chapter 14 modifications that you propose? And if so, what is the experience of that country?
Tom?
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at that. I think the answer to that is no, and part of that is most countries' reorganization laws or judicial proceedings are considerably different than the U.S. ones. And I think you could ask the question more generally. There's relatively little experience with even Chapter 11 going concern sales under a judicial proceeding in other countries. So I am not aware of anything remotely like this in other countries. And part of this gets to an issue that we can talk about later, which is non-U.S. regulators trusting regulators more than the U.S. judicial process because they're unfamiliar with it and they don't have analogies to it in their country. At least that would be my perspective on it. There's nothing comparable to this.
I can sort of add maybe a little something gingerly. I have a misspent use where I practiced American law in London, England for a couple of years, about 40 years ago. I think in most countries, and certainly under English law, there is a presumption of the discontinuation and winding up of a business when it fails, and that doesn't seem to exist as much under the U.S. bankruptcy laws. And we're really using that to preserve economic and social values in our reorganization practices. And so it's a continuation of what is may not be uniquely, but has been an important American feature of our insolvency law.
I don't know, Sir Paul Tucker, I know you're in the second panel. I don't know if you want to chime in on that, or we should take another question in the back.
Say at this stage is that I think, in terms of what Tom said, I think officials elsewhere in the world are careful students of the judicial process here.
Other questions from the audience?
So it sounds like from this, you all, Bill, you all view this as sort of a first option with Title II as a backstop, as opposed to the thought up in a lot of places just of doing this and repealing Title II. So you would favor retaining Title II in some fashion?
That's a personal view of mine. I don't know that there's a consensus on the Hoover Group or we've even focused on that. That gets into the practicalities of some inside the Beltway things. But yes, I believe, maybe it's again my misspent youth at the FDIC, at bottom, for the good of the society, there needs to be some residual ability to deal with the massive, all-encompassing crisis that we get every few generations, and that from my FDIC experience, OLA is an excellent way to do that. But I don't think we ought to overuse it, and I think we have an established bankruptcy law system that could work better in a lot of situations where regulators would otherwise be tempted to use OLA in a crisis because of the imperfections in existing bankruptcy law. I know there's some scholars that actually say because existing bankruptcy law won't work for these financial intermediaries, it shows they're too big and they ought to be broken up. This kind of goes the other way and says, let's make our bankruptcy laws more practical for the range of these financial intermediaries.
I think there's definitely a consensus among the group that regardless of whether Title II stays, which it most likely will, or were to go away, that Chapter 14 would still be a useful addition.
Yeah, and I think while there's not a group consensus on this, I'd like to echo one of Bill's comments and put a different spin on it. I think, and there have been bills introduced in Congress that start off with repeal Title II as the first section. I'm of a pragmatic belief that to try to get Chapter 14 implemented, you should stay focused on Chapter 14 and shouldn't put other, if you will, ornaments around it, like repeal Title II. I personally think, I agree with Bill personally, that I think the world is uncertain and we never know when some kind of discretion might be necessary. And so Title II remaining as a backstop, but a very infrequently used backstop, is not bad. But pragmatically, I think if you try to couple repeal Title II with the Chapter 14 amendments, you just make it more and more difficult to get the Chapter 14 amendments passed. And to me, that's goal number one, is get Chapter 14 in place, because whether or not you repeal Title II, it's not going to be used as much if you have an effective bankruptcy mechanism.
So that BPC certainly echoes that and believes Title II is a complement to Chapter 14, and also argues that anybody who says repealing Title II actually saves taxpayers money is using a congressional scoring trick. And that's another reason to be skeptical of repeal. Martin?
I'm going to ask Emily, you, and this may go to the second panel, but since you did the case study of Lehman, so Lehman, Monday morning it reopens, and you said it should be in a position to get access to capital, and you mentioned David Skeel giving options for getting capital. But I'm a little concerned if there were really the situation in financial markets that there was around the time of the Lehman bankruptcy, and a lot of sort of fear and concern that the new entity would require liquidity funding from the Federal Reserve or some government agency. And I'm just wondering if you think that's how high the probability you think that is of needing such government liquidity, and do you think the Fed would be in a position to provide it under the current 13.3 rules?
Well, I think the week of September 15th, 2008 is very instructive in that regard, because that was a situation where it was clear that there was a market-wide issue, and of course we have the example of the PDCF to look at, that a similar facility could still be introduced under the 13.3 rules. And so I think if that were the environment in which a post-Chapter 14 firm found itself, in all likelihood, it would need to turn to an industry-wide facility provided by the Fed in order to help with financing. And I say as much in the chapter. I think if this firm is really a one-off, which wasn't the case really in Lehman's case, but if it were a one-off firm, then I think you kind of have to look at these solvency figures and say, okay, this firm Lehman would have been, by these numbers, it would have been better capitalized than many of its peers after the proceeding. And so, at some point you have to say, okay, if the markets are still functioning properly, why wouldn't this firm get financing? And, and how big of a concern is it that it's going to be, that the market's just going to refuse to finance it? Why would the market choose to do that, especially if it was, willing to pay outsized interest rates and the like? And that's really what David kind of walks through in his chapter is, okay, it seems like there are really a lot of private options here. And then he sort of says, as a backstop, if there aren't, maybe it does make sense to change some of the Fed's emergency lending powers. But on the whole, his conclusion is that some of these concerns are greater than they need to be. I think that's right.
Tom may have views too. Tom, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's pretty correct. I thought David's piece in the book, which basically says he thinks most of the time markets will work. One of the reasons for this rapid recapitalization is to make it obvious to the markets that the entity is in fact solvent. And so I think usually there are market solutions. If there's a industry-wide problem, that is, liquidity is not being provided to any of these financial institutions, then I think the Fed should be able to provide liquidity under those unique circumstances. But in the case where it's just simply there is liquidity, but the question is, will it be provided to this recapitalized company? My general notion is markets will take care of that pretty well. But if there's an industry-wide problem of liquidity, it seems to me, yes, you need the Fed backstop.
So I think we have time for one more question. So who has the best question left?
I'll make mine quick. In your assumptions, Emily, you didn't mention anything about the regulators or the government knowing what was going on inside Lehman Brothers. I had heard, perhaps incorrectly, that the SEC actually had a team inside Lehman trying hard. I don't know if it was too few, too little, too late, or access, but they couldn't figure out what was going on. If you could address that, please.
That is an accurate description of the SEC's knowledge at the time. I think, under Chapter 14 or SPOE, unless the firm decides to file itself, there's a burden on the regulators to have some sense of what's going on. Overall, I think that the consensus is the Fed knew a little bit more about what was going on in the September 2008 period. But all of this is certainly contingent, unless the creditors who are at risk for losses can be relied upon to push the firm to file itself. This does require the regulators to have a sense of what's happening.
Important because then there's at least a roadmap for the regulator. I mean, they have to know what's going on in terms of solvency standpoint, but they also have to have a plan, right? And so,
absolutely, yeah. My understanding of the question was kind of knowing when to trigger, which I'm actually doing some other research on that now because I think that's a really tricky problem. I think there's some knowledge that can be gained just from looking at market pricing, but the regulators would have to be engaged for this to really be a surefire way for, especially for short-term creditors, to be comfortable that this would happen in a timely fashion.
And thank you for making that point with connection with living wills, because it feeds right into my chapter and the advantages of this change.
So let's thank Bill, Emily, John, and Tom for their work on this. I'm going to call the second panel up, and while they get up, I'm going to introduce them, and I'm going to also note that we're going to end a few minutes early. At 11:45, we're moving a little ahead of our schedule, or when we see the first snowflakes. It's still good. With that, let me start by introducing on the panel Randy Gwynn. Randy's the head of Davis Polk and Wardell's Financial Institutions Group. Randy has advised just about everybody in the world on these types of questions. He's a leading legal scholar. He's been a guest lecturer at Harvard and Penn Law Schools, speaks all over. He was a former law clerk to the U.S. Supreme Court, to Justice Rehnquist, a graduate of UVA Law School and BYU, and the great privilege of working with Randy, where he co-chaired our Failure Resolution Task Force with Tom Jackson and John Bavenzi, and it's fantastic to be reunited with Randy. Sitting to, I believe, Randy's right is Sir Paul Tucker. Sir Paul Tucker was a former deputy governor of the Bank of England and one of the most respected central bankers and financial policymakers of our time. His deep understanding of the capital markets developed a new rigor and set of relationships for the Bank of England, which informed his position on quantitative easing, monetary policy, and bank regulatory policy. As a former leading member of the G20 Financial Stability Board, he helped shape a lot of the global response to the financial crisis. Sir Paul is now a research fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Public Policy. He's a senior counsel at Sullivan & Cromwell. He's a member of the Economic Policy Working Group at Hoover, and probably about 5 more things that I don't have time to mention. Next to Sir Paul is Wilson Irvin. Wilson is the vice chairman in the Group Executive Office at Credit Suisse. He works on a variety of strategic proposals, especially policy forums related to bank capital and ending too big to fail. Prior to his current role, he was a chief risk officer at Credit Suisse, member of the executive board, chair of the capital allocation and risk management committee. Wilson is a respected voice and a deep thinker, really about the concepts of risk and financial stability. And one of the great insights I have in Oda Wilson is if you actually achieve financial stability, you've achieved no lending. So congratulations. Any lending in the world involves some amount of instability and risk, and that's a good thing. Wilson is a summa cum laude graduate in economics from Princeton University, and we're thrilled to have him here. And this group will be led by the most able moderator I know and my trusted colleague and kind of the brains behind BPC and the work that you all read. Justin Chardon, he's the Associate Director for the Financial Regulatory Reform Initiative at BPC. Justin has been there for 3 years now. Before that, he worked for both Senators Kent Conrad and Byron Dorgan of North Dakota. And before that, Justin's had about 3 other careers, including as a journalist and starting his own company, which has, I think, to this day, more than 100 employees.
I believe so.
Up in Fargo, North Dakota. So with that, I turn it over to everyone else.
Yeah, this weather is nothing. We laugh in North Dakota, but we are going to see how local government can deal with a systemic weather threat. And if I can really torture the analogy, instead of seeing a fire sale of securities, we're seeing a fire buy at grocery stores. Is that something, at least what I've heard reported? Thanks to the first panel. I want to mention, as I think Tom did, that the excellent book is out there that you can grab copies of. We also have copies of the BPC's Too Big to Fail report that Randy and Tom were co-authors of, along with John Bavenzi. So please feel free to grab those. Love to jump in here with the four of you. Excuse me, Paul. I was at an event you did in Boston this past spring, Boston University, with Daniel Gallagher.
Oh, yes.
And you said during that discussion that the thing we need to ask ourselves is, can we deal with failure? And it's a nice way to set up what we're doing here. Maybe we can start with Randy. Compared to where we were in the financial crisis, how well are the U.S. authorities, to start with, able to deal with failure, and have we solved too big to fail?
So I think Emily did a good job actually talking about Lehman. I think that you can answer that question, where we are now, best, or it's easiest to understand if we actually talk about where we were then. And where we were then is we had no legal tools that really were designed for the failure of a banking group. We had a statute for banks, but banks are actually only one part. The way the U.S. banks are organized, you have a holding company at the top, you have banks, you have broker-dealers, you have other affiliates. And there was the choice that the authorities had, or the banks had themselves, were reorganization under Bankruptcy Code. It was believed then, I'm not sure it's believed now, that the only option there was, a 2 or 3 year process. And the analogy to banks is that they're a melting ice cube, and during that 3 year period, much sooner than 2 or 3 year period, they would melt away to nothing. Then you had liquidation under Chapter 7. Well, that is fire sale of assets, so that didn't look attractive. And then you had the Federal Deposit Insurance Act that allowed you to deal with the bank subsidiary, but with nothing else in the group. And so I think it's fair, and then in addition to those sort of limited legal tools, I don't think you had any real contingency planning. You may have had contingency planning at the FDIC that no one knew about on a large bank failing, but no one had actually done any kind of simulation or created any kind of a plan for the failure of a banking group. In fact, I think the word living will was synonymous with individuals writing a piece of paper about what to do with donating their organs or not, as opposed to how to deal with a financial institution.
That's where it came from.
And so there had been no contingency planning, really. The legal tools really weren't there probably to deal with an institution, or at least no one knew how to use them. And just no real intellectual thought had gone into it. So that's where you are when all of a sudden you find yourself with Lehman Brothers failing. You really are faced with a situation of you can either bail out the institution or you can do a fire sale liquidation, and that neither of them is very attractive. And in that situation, when you have those choices, what we've seen in the past is that the authorities feel forced to pick a bailout. it's very different now for a variety of reasons. Number one, we have legal tools that allow both the FDIC, if it's invoked with Title II, and people have spent a lot of time through the resolution planning process figuring out how to resolve one of these groups under the Bankruptcy Code, and in the process have developed a strategy through a lot of conferences and discussions and thinking, which has become known as the single point of entry resolution strategy that a lot of people around the world think really would work with a large, complex financial group. And not only has the FDIC issued a public statement about how that could be implemented under Title II to show that they have the authority to do it, but a lot of the institutions have actually filed resolution plans explaining how they could be done under the existing Bankruptcy Code. Don't get me wrong, I am a huge proponent of a new Chapter 14, but I actually think one can do this maybe in a little messier way than under Chapter 14 under the existing Bankruptcy Code. In addition to having a strategy, and that strategy has not just been in the United States, there's been a lot of discussion of that strategy and other strategies across the globe, and so there's a lot more discussion among, or has been a lot more discussion over the last several years with regulatory authorities in different jurisdictions so that they now have a better idea of how they would coordinate a resolution of a cross-border institution. So those are sort of the tools that are very different. The last thing that I think is worthwhile saying, and normally people consider this as a resiliency question. In other words, normally you talk about resiliency against failure or resolvability. Resiliency is, have we reduced the probability of failure in the first place? And then if there is failure, nevertheless, have we made institutions resolvable so that the consequences are less catastrophic than they were in 2008? They actually play together because in attempting to make banks more resilient, the regulators and the banks themselves have increased their capital more than 2 times of what they had in 2008. If you look at the U.S. banking groups now, in addition, if you actually, since the Fed and other regulators have done stress testing, they actually have 50% more capital after a stress situation, a severely adverse stress situation, than they actually had in 2008. So capital, there's a lot more capital there. There's also a lot more liquidity, so that on the bank's balance sheet, if you actually look at their balance sheets now, and we'll see data better over time with the high-quality liquid asset reporting, which hasn't begun, but if you actually look at the liquid assets there now, they have about liquid assets equal to 35% of deposits. That's a lot more liquidity than the reserve requirements that applied to the largest banks before the Fed was created in 1913, which was about 25% for the highest banks. So there's a lot of embedded liquidity, and then there is something called TLAC that, although there's a new rule, it actually already exists on the bank's balance sheet, which is a combination of capital and long-term debt. Now, a lot of that, actually, a fair amount of that existed in 2008, but it wasn't usable because it was the long-term debt was mixed with short-term debt, and you couldn't impose losses on short-term debt legally without also imposing them on short-term debt. And if you impose them on short-term debt, the short-term debt would run throughout the system, and so the regulators sort of threw up their hands and say, well, we can't impose losses on this. That's very different now because even now the banks have already segregated. The short-term debt is now segregated at the operating subsidiary level. The long-term debt is at the holding company level, so it's now possible to impose those losses on long-term. And if you look at the numbers, it means that there's now 5 times the amount of usable TLAC now than existed in 2008. That makes resolving one of these institutions far more feasible than it was in 2008. I think feasible. In fact, I think there's so much, and I think there's actually enough liquidity on the balance sheets now, maybe forcibly so, that you don't even need a lender of last resort to fund these things through resolution. In fact, I think it raises the question about whether they've been forced to have too much liquidity, because I personally think that for every dollar of liquid assets that's on the bank's balance sheet is anywhere from $1 to $10 of loans not being made. And I think that's not a good public policy. And so frankly, I think it's better to have a lender of last resort to provide that liquidity on a secured basis than it is to force the banks to self-insure with all that liquidity.
So, Paul, Randy would say that we've made quite a lot of progress since the crisis. You were obviously there on the ground, and since then in the FSB. How would you answer your own question of whether we're able to deal with failure, and is the answer different for the U.S. versus Europe and the rest of the world?
I think for the US, and I said this when I was in office, I think there is no reason now why if a major firm failed there should be taxpayer equity support. And I think that has been the position for a few years now. But that doesn't mean it will be calm. I don't know whether this metaphor will work or not, but this is about circles of hell. And there are some circles of hell that are distinctly worse than others. I thought the previous panel made, if I can put it bluntly, a mistake in debating the resolution bankruptcy of one of these giant firms as though it would be an idiosyncratic event. I think there's one set of circumstances where it would be, which is internal fraud, and where it's demonstrable, and the authorities can say with complete conviction and honesty that it is local to the firm. I think that aside, or maybe a cyber thing as well, that aside, the circumstances in which one of these giant banks or dealers is going to fail are circumstances in which the economy is slowing, asset prices are falling, there is a great deal of uncertainty. So imagine one of them fails today. I don't know what the markets have done today, but it's been a bad few weeks. There would immediately be questions about every other significant firm across the planet. And so this is going to be messy in the sense of spillovers throughout the world financial system and the world economy, but it doesn't need to be anything like as deep as it was at the back end of 2008, 2009. If the achievement of my generation of policymakers was to avoid the Great Depression, but then have this prolonged recession, the achievement of the next generation of policymakers is to do better than we did. And I think the powers are definitely in place to do that already. And I think that the balance sheet structures in the US are pretty close to that as well. In Europe, and I'm taking Europe as a whole, the laws are in place. If anything, it's a slightly better law than the one here, and that's simply because it was done later, and so it was done after more debate. Perhaps I should have said, by the way, that when I was introduced, what wasn't said was that I chaired the Financial Stability G20 group on the resolution of too big to fail firms. So SPE, bail-in, MPE, all of that comes from that group. And actually, over here, I meant to say this as well, over here, if two people in this country ensured that the US authorities and the US debate embraced this approach to resolution, it's these two people, who I've been on a panel with each of them before. I've never been on a panel with both of them at the same time. In Europe, the law is somewhat better, marginally, but the firms do not start off with the same nice structure. It's an accident of US regulatory history that your big banks and dealers have pure holding companies. And what this whole resolution thing is about, and this is true for Chapter 14 or Title II resolution, it is essentially that if the losses aren't going to go to taxpayers, which they absolutely mustn't, well, where are they going to go? They need to go to creditors. Well, do you care about the order in which they go to creditors? Well, yes, you do. The big point then is to separate the pure financial liabilities from the financial liabilities that are attached to an operational service. So how do you do that without a major reform in bankruptcy law and in insolvency, in the statutory insolvency stack? Well, you do it through a combination of contract and, even more importantly, structure. The beauty of the holding company is the structural subordination means that nobody is going to dispute whether or not a bond issued from the holding company is truly subordinated and should take losses before all of the liabilities of the operating company. And many European banks and dealers don't have that structure yet and need to move towards it. But there's more to be done. I think, let me say this because it will affect the tone a bit. I think much more has been achieved in this country than public discourse, and particularly debate in this capital city, gives credit to. I think that's very largely due to the bankruptcy versus resolution debate. I'm not at all opposed to the reforms to Chapter 14, but it's from sitting in other capital cities. This does look a bit like medieval scholasticism about, do you prefer a world crisis to be solved by a court? And by the way, not an Article 3 court. No one should have any doubt that bankruptcy courts in this country are not Article 3 courts. They're courts with limited jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction could be challenged during a Chapter 14 process. And bankruptcy court cases have been taken to the Supreme Court 2 or 3 times in the past. Do you prefer it to be done via a judge, or do you prefer it to be done by administrator? That's really a second order question compared with, does anybody have the powers to do it at all? And are these creatures organized in a way that makes it possible to do that? And you have that, and you should be pleased about that as a nation. And this certainly isn't an argument for doing the Chapter 14 reforms. It is an argument for not talking yourself down quite as much as perhaps you do in this area, which is uncharacteristic for America.
And we may come back to that a little bit too. Wilson, though, you were on the ground up close and saw how the Lehman disaster unfolded. Not being at Lehman, but you watched it up close. How, first of all, do you agree with the comments made so far? And second, how do you think things there might have unfolded differently in the crisis as a whole if we'd had our current structure and authorities in place then?
No, I think this is a great question, and it is, I think, an incredibly instructive and important and interesting case. I was head of risk for Credit Suisse at the time, one of the poor souls who was dragged down to the Fed that weekend, had a look at their books, had a look at all the alternatives that we had at the time, and it was a colossal failure. We walked out of there Sunday night, and Monday morning, the world started going into a tailspin. That was the moment when, for me, the crisis changed from a credit cycle crisis to something that I had never seen, I'd read about, but had never seen before. Counterparties, markets, everything we touched became different the next morning and hit levels we hadn't seen since the 1930s and behaviors that I had never seen. So I think Lehman is incredibly important, and it is the thing that turned this from a credit cycle into a systemic crisis of huge magnitude. M's analysis in the book, I think, is terrific. It's hard work. But she shows that the losses that we had from an uncoordinated bankruptcy of Lehman reaching to hundreds of billions of dollars. If you were a creditor of Lehman Brothers, you could have your money tied up for years, and you knew you weren't going to get very much back. Everybody with a brain is going to run from every similarly situated organization as fast as they can in those circumstances. The embedded losses at Lehman, I think her book is actually, or chapter is a little conservative on this. We looked at the books. I think it would have wiped out equity, maybe reached into the sub-debt, but would have, the resources available to Lehman at that time would have been able, if you could have bailed in the long-term holding company debt, would have been enormous, ample to staunch the problem and restore solvency to a level with hard assets. You would have solvency ratios twice that of any other firm in the country. So I think you could have restored solvency to an enormous extent. If you would have done that, equity would have still lost everything. Long-term debt might have been impaired, but everybody else would be better off, and most importantly, all of us in this room would have been vastly better off. I think that would have changed the systemic dynamics, and I think Monday morning would have been a rally, not the plunge that we saw. So the initial question was, have we solved too big to fail? I think we have two solutions, to Paul's point, that are increasingly close to each other in terms of how they operate economically. They're different legally, but they become increasingly close economically. Bill talked before about an FDIC proposal that came out very early. I'd call this sort of Title II 1.0. I think that has improved significantly. I think they've used the discussion between Chapter 14 and the FDIC has improved a lot. And I actually think the economics between Title II 2.0 and Chapter 14 2.0 would now be very, very similar. I don't think there'd be a difference. I don't think there's a bailout differential between those two. I think they'd be almost identical, and I think that's a strength. I think these two camps, although we spend a lot of time debating whether the white cat is better than the black cat, What I really care about is that it catches mice, and that we don't put ourselves into the same kind of problems that we saw back then when government bailouts seemed like the only thing we could do. Now, some people do assert that this is hard, it's a knowable, very challenging problem. I would say this isn't that hard. This is just corporate finance.
That's right.
This isn't putting a man on the moon. This is not
right.
curing cancer. This is corporate finance. You can see it. You can plan for it. And I think with things like living wills, you can force a lot of those bits of thinking that need a little bit of time to be done early, and it really won't be that hard. So I very much agree with Paul. I think we have cracked this problem. I think markets agree with it. Nobody really knows about it for some reason in the United States. I've spoken to a number of people, including regional Fed board members, who don't know that this debate has been going on. So we need to at least make sure they know there's a cat out there.
There's much higher awareness elsewhere, isn't there?
Yeah.
Do you have any of you have a theory as to why that is, and why there's so much disagreement about? You seem to agree that there's a lot of progress made. Why the American public largely doesn't agree?
It looks from the outside like an intra-DC struggle rather than explaining to the American people what your legislators and authorities have done. And I don't think that's just my own view. I think that view would be held somewhat in other capitals and would worry them.
Is it?
A bit.
Is
But
it-
anyway, you're part of the solution, and both of the reports are part of the solution. And what I would say to American officials is get out and explain what's been done. These people in office at these institutions have a legal responsibility to make this work. That's the duty they've been given by Congress, and they need to kind of get that across to the American people. Not that it's
I also think we may have been stuck with a bad label for this problem. Too big to fail. Immediately people goes to, oh, can we measure the size of these institutions? I think the Chapter 14 book goes to a much better place, which is how do we make failure tolerable? It won't be fun,
yeah,
but we can avoid the bad circles
Yeah.
of hell.
yeah.
So I don't really care so much about big versus small. I care about that any bank, whatever size, you've got a failure plan that works without destroying the American economy, causing systemic stress, or acquiring taxpayer support.
But I think that big versus small is one of the reasons why the discussion we're having today doesn't have a lot of political traction outside of the people dealing with it, which is I think in a lot of these places there is an awful lot of, and Randy said this, is an awful lot of the way you solve too big to fail is to make them small, and so you don't care about it anymore. And there are impulses in that. I think the FDIC has done a splendid job with the single point of entry, but there are people who think it's an illegitimate use of Title II because it's not really liquidating the firm, and Title II is a liquidation mandate in it. So I think you've got to put into this the political calculation that a lot of the people who aren't convinced the problem's been solved is because they don't want it solved.
That's right.
By
That's right.
the failure side.
Yeah, they have other agendas.
Yeah,
No,
it's
which is fine, but a good principle of democratic politics
Right.
is be completely open about your agendas. I mean, otherwise, how can we have deliberation and try and exercise public responsibility at all well?
What's actually interesting, too, on this big, small thing is I had the pleasure, I use that word ironically, as a young associate to actually read every page of the legislative history of the Banking Act of 1933, which includes the Glass-Steagall Act. And if you actually read those hearings, you see that Carter Glass of Glass-Steagall, his diagnosis of the problem was we had 10,000 banks that failed within a few years. His diagnosis was they were too small and too undiversified. If they were just big and diversified like the Canadian banks, they wouldn't have failed. And so he had two solutions. He had obviously the famous Glass-Steagall Act, but his other solution, which he failed on, was to authorize interstate branching, across the United States, which would have resulted, and he sort of encouraged merging and things like that. It didn't happen. So it's interesting because he looked at and he saw 10,000 bank fails, and he said the problem was they're too small and undiversified. We see larger, more diversified banks fail, and we say, oh, it must be because they're too big, so we need to. But if we went to the extreme, we're back to 10,000 unit banks in 1930s, and that didn't work so well either. So I think the real issue is not big or small, it's having tools at work, having risk, real honest risk management, having the sort of things that we've actually done the last few years in terms of stress testing, real risk management, higher capital, better liquidity, and so forth.
Let's stick on that higher capital for a minute. You gave a brief discussion of what TLAC is. You were involved certainly in the FSB in putting that proposal together, I believe. And this is an important point that was finalized last November by the FSB as a final rule on what this loss absorbing capital needs to be. Wilson, did the FSB get it right with TLAC?
We're writing a comment letter, and we're going to complain about a lot of details over the next couple weeks. We work with Randy to collect all the criticisms of the whole banking sector here on this. But if I was going to step back from the micro stuff to the big stuff, I think it's good. I think it's fit for purpose. It's well scaled. If you look at any of the banks that really had bad crises in 2008, those are the most severe events we've seen for 50, 75 years, the most severe ones for which we have data. It would be enough for any of those banks to have been recapitalized with room to spare. So we can argue about this detail or that detail, but the important thing is it will ensure there's enough money where we need it, not some big mutualized fund, but enough money at each institution that'll be priced by the market, that will create a disciplining effect. I think that's hugely important. As Paul noted, we're lucky in the United States. We happen to have a lot of the right structure and a lot of the right debt to do this. In Europe, there's actually going to be a major structural revolution. People aren't really talking about it, but it's requiring banks over there to really reorganize themselves to create that separation of loss-bearing recapitalization liabilities that can be used in a Chapter 11 or Chapter 14-like recap versus the operations. That's going to be a big move. It will cost banks billions of dollars, and it costs my bank hundreds of millions of dollars. But for me, that's money well spent.
And Paul, all this new TLAC that's going to have to be issued by the banks raises the question of who's going to buy these bonds. And can you answer that? And are there some unintended consequences that we need to be aware of?
So I think the really massive issue here, and my sense is that it isn't focused on enough yet, which I'm slightly surprised by because it was on the work program a couple of years ago, is who should not be allowed to hold these bonds. So first of all, other banks and other dealers. So if Bank A holds the structurally subordinated bonds of Bank B and Bank B holds Bank C's, well, then the system as a whole has no gone concern loss absorbing capacity. And then it shouldn't just be banks, it should be anything that's bank-like that is potentially runnable. So I think there's a big set of issues for securities regulators about whether money market funds and to what extent open-ended funds should be able to hold these bonds. And then there's another set of issues for securities regulators of a slightly different kind, but it's been reinforced, it's not a new thought, reinforced by what's happened in Italy recently, which is to the extent these bonds are distributed to retail investors, retail investors need to be told in advance in the prospectus that these things are deeply subordinated and they get whacked immediately after the equity, and they're not some kind of near neighbor of an insured deposit. So then there's the question, so who will hold them? And I don't know, this is capitalism. It's and to the extent that people don't want to hold them or they're very expensive, well then these big banks will shrink. And part of what some of us had in mind in this whole thing was a process where we wanted to unleash market forces. I mean, a lot of the shorthand which all of us use is that the banks were bailed out. The bank bondholders were bailed out. The bank creditors were bailed out. It's often said insurance companies, pension funds, et cetera, asset managers did a great job during the crisis. Yeah, because the banks were bailed out. And next time, they're not going to be bailed out. Next time, the holders of these instruments are going to get whacked, and they're going to find themselves owners of banks, and that needs to be factored into their business models, into their own prospectuses, into their expectations of returns, and into their own regulation. But I think the job of the authorities is to determine who should not be able to hold them in the interests of stability, not who, for goodness sake, must hold them. It's a market economy. This is all about making banking part of capitalism again. That's what this is about underneath. Banks here and in Europe became part of a socialized economy, and no one wants that.
Yeah, arguably, this is the biggest privatization we've ever done, if we get this right. We're talking with TLAC, it's a $4 trillion market we need to build. That's before China. When China comes into the system a little later on, that'll be $5+ trillion. So that's a big privatization. One of the things that's important, here's where I take a little bit of issue with Paul. I do think you've got to be careful about who owns it, but if you need $5 trillion of loss absorbency for the big banks, you're going to need some big markets, right? And if you restrict retail, open-end funds, pension funds, other banks, insurance companies, you start to run down your list of people who've got money pretty quickly. So I think it ought to be clear what they own. I think you do need to make sure that banks don't own each other TLACs. There's a few specific places where you'd want to go after contagion hard. But I don't think you ought to make it tougher than equity.
You'd want concentration limits, though, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You know, you wouldn't want some big insurance company to own 10% of every global SIFIs TLAC. You know, that would not be a very good idea, because then the president would be asked, and the Congress would be asked to bail out the insurance company. This is about dispersing risk, but the spirit is the same.
The other thing that I would add to this too, and Wilson, you probably have this data better than I do as an economist, but I think before, when you looked at Lehman, I think the Lehman bonds, got discounted down to like 20%, 20 cents on the dollar. And I have to say, I've always been a little skeptical of the FDIC's study that they would somehow recover 97 cents on the dollar of Lehman. But let's assume that it's 90 cents, or one can say it's going to be a range between 85 and 95 cents. If people can actually look at that and value it, given the greater certainty of the new strategies and things, that's actually a huge benefit compared to a situation where people say, oh my goodness, this stuff may only be worth 20 cents on the dollar. So I think the recoveries will be better, and I think the uncertainty will be less. So even if you're imposing losses on various groups, those losses are not going to be as variable, they're going to be more predictable, and they should be less.
It was one of the things that really shocked me at Lehman, having spent that whole crazy weekend looking at the toxic asset books and seeing how bad they were. And it looked like they were going to be equity insolvent and probably go through preferreds and sub-debt. But we went through another 80+ billion. The debt traded at 9 cents the next week. So it was very strange to look at the inside value and then the ex-post value when you layer on top very messy bankruptcy, multiple competing insolvency unwinds.
And I take it the recoveries were way better than 9 cents, even.
They were
about 27,
Yeah.
okay.
So we had some uplift. We had a lot of toxic assets bounce back, and there was a little market overreaction. But even that 20 cents, as you point out in your book, represent hundreds of billions of dollars of value destruction for the owners. So if we can get away from that system which tells everybody to panic, my own estimates are you would have probably gotten mid-80s on the long-term debt. And the debt was trading in kind of low 90s, high 80s beforehand, so it would not be a huge discontinuity, not a huge market signals. Perhaps most importantly, you would not have sent those kind of signals to runnable short-term obligations, things that are very important for the real economy, for the sense of safety and security that American consumers have. It would completely forestall that.
There's been some other criticism of TLAC since it's come out, and Vice Chairman Honig is here with us today, and I'm going to take the risk of trying to summarize a speech you gave on Wednesday, and you should by all means correct me if I get any of it wrong. But as I understood your argument, it's not that TLAC is a terrible idea in and of itself, but there's a risk, one, that with all this new debt out there, there'll be a strong incentive to increase leverage and reach for yield for the banks to be able to service the debt. In a crisis, when banks have to service the debt, it's going to drain capital from the operating banks to go to the holding company to shore that up, which makes them less safe and sound. That there should be more of a focus on equity and not just on TLAC, and that TLAC should not be used as a blunt instrument, the same level for all global SIFIs, but instead it should be tailored to each individual global SIFI in conjunction with their regulator. Okay, good. I've been missing anything. So some criticisms there. Tom, would you, or anybody else, would you like to respond to that? Does the Vice Chairman have a good point here?
I think I would say. Oh, sorry, Tom. I've forgotten we got
Go ahead,
Tom.
Tom.
No, Paul, go ahead,
No,
because I think your paper actually.
You go, Tom.
Well, I was going to make the comment you made in your paper, which is that that one of the advantages of debt over equity is that there's a monitoring function by these people that's going to be, I think, important to the system. That is, the creditors, whether it's bailed-in debt or subordinated debt or something, who have the risk, whether it's under a single point of entry or whether it's under Chapter 14, of essentially being converted to equity interest, have a very strong interest to watch out over what management's doing and the like. One, equity simply doesn't have, and two, equity has an incentive to gamble as things begin to get bad because they have upside. And the creditors, because they don't get upside, don't have this incentive to do the gambling. So I think they are a much more effective monitor, and that should be factored into the equation.
Can I add to that? I agree with it. I would say two things in response to Tom. So first of all, this debate about whether or not there should be more equity, I think a perfectly good case can be made for more equity, but we are where we are. Congress, G20 leaders, everybody else, and in a sense, I think there's a whole bunch of people all around the world that are going to continue the battle for more equity, but I think that is separable from, given where we are right now, what are duties of public officials to the people they serve in terms of ensuring with the regime that there is, can we make these things resolvable? The second thing I would say, and I think I just disagree with Tom here, which is the exercise of discretion. I am much more comfortable with the exercise of discretion by the authorities or by a judge, and I don't think there's much difference in the exercise of discretion there. I think it's an exaggeration by the Chapter 14 people at the point of collapse than I am with the exercise of discretion by the Fed or the FDIC or my former employer or the ECB in deciding how much of this TLAC there should be for individual firms, given the scale of lobbying and everything that there would be to find particular circumstances. There's one, I'm not going to name the firm, there's one massive bank in the world that is absolutely convinced, nearly everybody, that it isn't involved in investment banking and wholesale banking, except that it is. And I once said to the chairman of this bank, but you are. And he looked a bit discombobulated, as though I'd kind of discovered a deep secret. I think having a standard policy, which is you're going to have roughly as many gone concern, loss-absorbing bonds as your equity holding, I think that is a standard policy across all the big G-SIBs or whatever they're called. I think that's a pretty good thing. And I think it's fairly simple in terms of explaining it to the people's elected representatives. This is what we've done. We've made them hold, issue as many bonds as you have made them hold equity, so that if all the equity is gone, we can turn these bonds into equity and replace it. I think that's a kind of simple, reasonably robust policy.
And one of the things.
Please. Yeah.
I appreciate your point. First of all, to the point of discretion, Paul. If discretion is a fear of yours, then we have a problem with living wills, because that is a discretionary process, and we have to make a judgment as to whether it's credible or non-credible. And my problem with a massive rule on TLAC is it actually forces all institutions into somewhat of a single model. If you look at if they've chosen more equity and they've now they have to bring this on, what they have to do is lever up to make it pay. And I'm not sure that's where we want to go. So one way or the other,
They'll be constrained by the leverage cap on how far they can lever
the
up.
assumption is, but what you do is you change your business model. When you get under the risk-based models, you change the model to make sure you maximize, given that you're forced to bring on more debt, you have to change your model.
No, but the leverage cap isn't about the risk-weighted thing.
No,
It's
because
total
there's off-balance sheet activities that are enormous under the risk-based capital standards that are not in the leverage ratio or are very minimally adopted.
Oh, you should fix your leverage ratio
well,
then.
thank you.
And
Now,
actually,
that
the way
brings
you
me-
account,
that-
and
Paul,
actually
that
the way you
brings me
account
to the
for
first
derivatives
point.
there.
That brings me to the first point. We are where we are, but we shouldn't be there. We should, if that's the case, then we should focus on, because one of your major issues that you're trying to address here is contagion. And the best thing to deal with contagion is have the right amount, have strong equity across the industry so that the idiosyncratic failure doesn't trigger the others. So we are where we are, but we need to think about more equity. We are where we are, but living wills are where we are. And rather than force everyone into a single solution, we should, through the living will process, get the right balance of equity and debt. So that if you have a firm that has focused on equity, they're not forced into a debt situation that I think changes their business model. So that's really my point. It's not that I have a problem with TLAC or with long-term debt per se, but I want to make sure that it doesn't change the entire business model just to make that target.
The international variant of TLAC, if a bank, so say the requirement is 20%, a bank could decide to hold all 20 percentage points in equity. The US rule is slightly different from the global rule in that respect. And I think I think both have advantages, but we kind of get very techie in debating that. We're probably going to come to living wills later.
That was my next question.
Let me
Okay.
make one comment on this debt versus equity thing, because I actually don't think the trade-off is between if we have more long-term debt, you'll have less equity. I think it's actually, the trade-off is actually short-term debt and long-term debt. So I think it's actually shifting there. And if you actually shift from short-term to debt to long-term debt, that's probably actually a good thing from a liquidity standpoint.
But assuming, the assumption is that you will merely shift out. But if you have a lot of equities sitting there in the bank, you've got to lever up. If you put a blanket, you will have X% debt relative to your risk-based asset position, especially if you're not getting credit for the equity, which remember, TLAC assumes, one of the reasons you insist on TLAC or debt is that you've got to have something when you fail. So that's why you want it there. But to encourage you to have less equity so you can meet, because you have this strict TLAC rule, I think.
So I'm going to give away a little
Under
secret.
risk.
In one of the comment letters, you're actually going to see a comment saying that banks should have total freedom to substitute debt for equity in the TLAC proposal.
Oh, well, you're a little closer to that, that's for sure. But remember, you still have incentives around debt, because with equity, you can suspend dividends and not go into bankruptcy. With debt, it's a little harder. Especially, let's say you have a recession and your bank isn't insolvent and your holding company isn't insolvent, but you got a cash flow problem. What do? You got to go to the earning asset and you got to pull it out during the recession so that you can make sure your debt's serviced so that you don't go into bankruptcy prematurely. So you got to think about that.
We got to get to questions here in just a moment, but I want to just spend a brief minute on living wills since that's come up here. Maybe Randy or Wilson, if you want to talk briefly about whether living wills have improved since 2012 when they were first submitted. And then Paul, I think you've written about how you think the process would really be better if the government regulator wrote the living will rather than the bank wrote it. So maybe if you could comment on that as well.
Maybe to jump in, they have gotten better, but it's a low bar. If you looked at the original living wills, I think they were misguided in their purpose. They weren't trying to say, how would I do a version 2.0? they were saying, well, if I end up with a multiple competing insolvency a la Lehman, I'd like to have better information about all the dead bodies and different organs that are going to be distributed around. So I think the exam question needs to change. The public sections have gotten better. They used to be abysmal. I actually am crazy enough to have read them all when they first came out. The last batch is much better. They actually tell you something about how the banks are reorganizing themselves, how they can use SPOE bail-in most cases to recapitalize and avoid this kind of contagion. So this last batch is actually much better. That said, if I was in the challenging job of actually having to run a resolution, I'd want something different. I think there is still something where you'd want those to work better for something that if you get some crazy piece of news on a Friday night, that you've got something that is much easier to use, much more workable for either a Chapter 14 2.0 or a Title II.
Okay.
So I think the resolution plans have gotten significantly better. I think the 2015 plans are significantly better, in part because the process has improved. I think the early days of the process, the regulators were really feeling their way in the dark. They really weren't quite sure what assumptions to impose on the banks or allow the banks to make. I think over time that's evolved. They've become more aware. And listen, in fairness to the regulators, no one had done this before. This was all new. So I think that there's been kind of a learning process both by the industry and by the regulators, and I think it's much better. It's a much healthier process, much better dialogue now. And I think the one thing that's still a little bit opaque is how the grading system works. So you get grades, but you're not quite sure what the criteria is. And so I think, for instance, I think it was Professor Scott. It was either Professor Scott, or I think it was Professor Scott, who wrote an editorial a year and a half ago or so when the FDIC had failed all 11 first-wave filers. And he said, you know, if I were actually running a class and all of my students failed, that would say more about me as a teacher than it did about the students.
So what are the consequences
I want to run 2 points
Yeah, yeah.
together here, because I'd like to come back to Chapter 14 during the questions. So, and I'm going to use living will as a term of art, which it's a term of art in relation to Title I. The expression living will expression started, I think, in Chicago and London, and that kind of didn't have quotes around it. But with quotes around it, it means under Title I. And as Tom said at the beginning, and I'm going to put it more strongly, no one sane thinks that any GSIB is going to be put through bankruptcy with the state of the current bankruptcy law. Let's assume that's true. If that were the case, it would be an absolute tragedy if all the effort were going into these Title I living wills rather than to how these firms could be sorted out under either Title II or, if it gets passed and if some of its problems can be sorted out, under Chapter 14. And I'm not an insider anymore, but when I hear about the length of these things, people have lost the plot. When in late 2009, early 2010, we were trying to work out whether SPE, we didn't call it SPE then, but kind of bail-in would work. I had a team do a resolution plan for the top 20 firms in the world, and I said it can be no longer than a page and a half for each of them. And the key thing is not all of this detail, and I think Tom and I would agree about this, the key thing is, can you get the losses from the operating subsidiaries up to the holding company? This is, if there's one key fact about each firm, is there that mechanism that when the losses in the operating subsidiary exceed the equity invested in the subsidiary, does the holding company nevertheless have to stand behind the subsidiary? Mm-hmm. And something that is completely missing from the debate over here is this is the key thing. The key thing is a mechanism for making holding companies stand behind the losses of their subsidiaries. And you could say, well, they could guarantee them. But actually, in a world of many nation states, no one's going to accept an uncollateralized guarantee. The idea of doing it via super-subordinated debt that the host authority can trigger is just a way of having a collateralized guarantee and putting the power in the hands of the host authority which is incentive compatible for the home authority. Now, the reason I say that is that whenever we hear the reports, and I read them a bit in the Wall Street Journal and the FT about these living wills, nothing is said about those things. And yet, if someone said to me, if I was put back in office this lunchtime, and someone said, okay, you're chairing the FSB Resolution Steering Group again, you've got one piece of information you want tonight. So show me how much of this internal debt now exists. And so my worry about the living will debate, and I want to reinforce this because a lot of people from Congress here, I think, as well as journalists, is there is a risk that the bureaucrats and the consultants and the advisors and the firms are drowning you in detail when actually it is a few simple but massive things that will determine whether or not any of the top firms in the world can actually be sorted out.
Right. Let's get a few questions in if anybody has one, and there are a couple mics around still.
Can I jump on that while we're looking for hands? It's one of the points that's thrown out as making this thing hard, which is international cooperation. And that seems, if you say, oh, we've got to trust everybody and there needs to be cooperation around the world, that seems like a very tough challenge to a successful resolution. I think the point that Paul was just making is super important. I don't think we're going to get a treaty in our lifetimes, but if we have money in the right places and incentives, frankly, maybe I'm too much of a finance person, I trust that a lot more. If you look at where the financial cooperation broke down last time, it was two things. One, it was taxpayer money, and if it's my tax money or his tax money, we're going to fight like heck to make sure he pays more than me. That's a recipe for conflict. With bail-in, you're looking at private capital, TLAC, that's been set aside in advance, so you're not looking at nation-state money, you're looking at money that's supposed to be in harm's way. And secondly, you have to pre-place money so that letting go a UK operation or letting go a Japanese operation becomes super expensive, too expensive actually to make work in practice because you've got embedded TLAC. So it forces a holding company to cooperate internationally. It keeps those operating subsidiaries alive. And I think that helps make the process a lot more predictable.
And it forces a massive choice. So this brings cooperation and coordination forward. It makes it ex ante. So imagine that there's a big American bank or dealer, and it's got a massive subsidiary in a foreign jurisdiction. There's one in particular, but I can't remember which one it is. And 4 groups of people need to agree that the holding company is going to invest this supersubordinated debt that can be triggered by the host authorities in the subsidiary. The board of the holding company, the regulators of the holding company, the board of the subsidiary, and the regulators of the subsidiary. It's the regulators that matter. Now, imagine the regulators of the home country say, we think the host authorities are going to be trigger happy. We're not doing this. So SPE isn't going to work for that group. Or alternatively, the host might say, well, we've got the laws and they will invest the stuff, but if I shoot the losses up to the holding company, they haven't either got the ability or the will to do it, and my subsidiary isn't going to be operational on a standalone basis, and therefore we're not going to do that. In other words, for each of the big banks in the world, they're going to have to decide whether or not to ring fence the subsidiaries, essentially, or shrink them on the basis of whether or not an ex-ante agreement can be reached by the home and host authorities. That is the big cross-border issue, other than the one about bankruptcy courts.
Fair enough. Question? Yes, sir.
Can I add a comment about bankruptcy courts? Because I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding.
Yeah, very briefly, because we got about 5 minutes.
Okay, just a very brief comment. Remember, the entity, the recapitalized entity is not in bankruptcy and not subject to the jurisdiction of the bankruptcy court.
Yeah.
What the bankruptcy court, and actually in Chapter 14 it's a district judge, an Article 3 judge, but what that judge is doing is essentially doing the bail-in triggering in the entity that's left in bankruptcy has no operations. The relevant entity is not in bankruptcy after this process.
Yeah, I know. This is a perception about the exercise of discretion by U.S. judges. That's what this is. And so the way you set it up, Tom, and actually I'm not making a point about facts, I'm making a point about perceptions. The way you set it up is we can have it done through bankruptcy, and then the rhetorical trope you used was that's the rule of law, or we can have it done by administrative agencies. And what lies behind that is that you think that that a bankruptcy judge would exercise less discretion than an agency created by Congress. And I think that's what capitals elsewhere in the world need to satisfy themselves of. But all I would say, if you scan your mind back over big judicial decisions from this company, famous all around the world, people are going to be impressed by just how much discretion U.S. judges exercise day to day on contracts, on torts, quite apart from constitutional issues. And that's not saying you're wrong. I think that's the perception issue that the U.S. authorities would have to take to other capitals.
I agree it's the perception. I don't want to, but if you look at the Chapter 14 proposal itself, it specifies what gets left behind and what gets transferred. There is no discretion by statute. And the comparable in Title II would be for the FDIC to say it was going to adhere to absolute priority rules or something like that.
I think it should do that.
Which it hasn't done but could do.
All right. Sir, why don't you go ahead?
Tip Ghosh, I want to address to Wilson and to the rest of the panel, how do you deal with counterparty risk, especially on derivatives contracts, especially in the Lehman example, but even if it's a smaller investment bank, that you're talking about derivatives contracts that are across different asset classes, not just on debt. The systemic risk from that is not really addressed by the current resolution plan, but it's something from a capital market perspective very important.
This is an important question. It's actually when we first started working on bail-in back in 2009, actually was to me one of the central things that you needed to fix. The rapid derivatives unwind at Lehman, which everybody had to go through, was destabilizing, changed everybody's risk position, and imposed massive losses in the tens of billions on the estate. So it's one of the things you've got to fix. This was something that did require coordinated effort to change, and we've gotten some help from supervisors saying, by the way, everybody's got to change it because it would be hard to be a first mover. But there's something called an ISDA protocol. It's a very geeky legal process, but it commits all of the dealers to basically keeping their contracts outstanding if there's a good recap, if there's a good, whether it's a Title I or Title II regime in the United States, you keep your contracts with those operating companies that are not in bankruptcy, and you avoid that problem. That saves an enormous amount of losses that could be imposed on the estate, and I think it also brings down, solves a lot of the systemic issues. You know, we got through the Lehman unwind, but it was not pretty, and it's not the kind of thing you want to do when there's a lot of other things to worry about. So I think that's one that's been fixed through a separate initiative, sort of a public-private process, but it's over 90% fixed now, so the dollars now are quite manageable.
Are the asset managers signing up to that?
They will have to. The new regime will prohibit banks from dealing with asset managers going forward. We'll need to get regs in different countries, but that'll be coming over the next year. That will force basically banks to cease dealing with people that don't sign up to the contract.
Yeah, that was the solution we talked about a few years ago. Let me just say on this, I understand why asset managers have said what they've said, but they have sent a pretty unfortunate signal to the authorities around the world because they have essentially announced they will always put private interests first, even when that is to the detriment of private interests. It has been a very strange episode over the last 18 months, one that's played out since I left office.
I know we were going to try to break a little bit early because of the weather that I'm sure will show up at some point. So thank you very much for a great panel, and Aaron will say a few last words here.
So very briefly, I want to thank the panel. Join me in thanking the panel. I want to go out of my way to thank Hoover, who's just put on a fantastic event. I want to encourage everybody to grab a copy of the book because I have a sense that nobody's going out tomorrow. So perhaps you have something to read in addition to the wonderful book. We also have copies of the BPC report, and I want to finally thank all of you for braving the snow and actually showing that Washington is a city that can work at least until noon. Thank you all. Have a great weekend.